Technology today is evolving with tremendous speed, with augmentation of big data, dramatic improvement in computing power, and continuous innovation in machine learning methods. Artificial intelligence technologies is shaping the future of this world, and we are entering the new era of human history. But on the other hand, the security threats come along with those new technology and remain part of the digital world. This year, we welcome the return of the Hack in the Box Security Conference to the region after an 8-year break. Hack in the Box continues to be the forefront of most advanced cybersecurity topics, and Huawei is so proud to be the diamond sponsor of this event. As a global leading ICT company, Huawei is dedicated to closely collaborating, innovating, and establishing international standards with other global organizations to ensure the integrity and the security of our solution and service. Hack in the Box is a premier cybersecurity conference in the Middle East, and I hope to use those 2 days as an opportunity to increase the public awareness on cybersecurity and to bring Huawei along with other key sponsors here together for a closer collaboration on this very important subject. Our keynote speaker today has been a computer security researcher for most of her life. She started her career working as a security strategist at Microsoft, in which she created Microsoft's first bug bounty program. She was also directly involved in creating the U.S. Department of Defense, the first bug bounty program. In 2014, SC magazine added her to its Women in IT Security list, and she was also named one of the 10 women in information security that everyone should know. Formerly, the Chief Policy Officer at HackerOne, a vulnerability disclosure company. She is currently the founder and the CEO of Luta Security. As a visiting scholar at MIT, she also recently presented the first system dynamic model of the vulnerability economic, which explained the underlying economic force behind the zero-day market. Today, she's here to share how data and the use of dynamic models can help make more accurate prediction when it comes to security breach. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Ms. Katie Moussouris.
Thank you so much, and welcome everyone to Hack in the Box. It is my honor to be here to present to you. Now, what I'm going to be talking about is built from the experiences of my career. Now, I had a birthday on my way here. In fact, I think I missed my birthday, so I think it doesn't count that I did not have a birthday, and I'm still 1 year younger. But I turned 44. And in the over 20 years that I've been a professional in the security industry, I've seen these patterns emerging where we try to present these glib solutions to complex problems. And the only thing that I've noticed is that we keep making some similar mistakes. So what we're going to talk about are pieces of the experiences that I've had, the things that we have tried, the things that have worked, and some of the things that will surprise you. So this is a little bit about me. Thank you for the wonderful introduction. I'm on Twitter, and this is a word cloud of things that I tweet about quite a lot, especially karaoke. We won't be doing any singing for this keynote, but the fact of the matter is, I never, as a young computer programmer, and then later a young hacker, I never imagined that I would be responsible for helping to renegotiate cyber arms control agreements. I never imagined that I would be on this stage presenting to you today. And in fact, I believe it was because a different keynote couldn't make it, hence my Crouching Tiger sudden keynote. So this is a little bit about how I explain my work to my family who do not work in cybersecurity. I had the honor of testifying before the US Congress about the Uber data breach and how the bug bounty experience that they were trying to use as a cover-up for that data breach was actually an extortion payment. I talked about these markets of vulnerability disclosure and zero-day markets, and I talked about the fact that we are, at this moment, shaping the world market in 0 days and vulnerabilities, not just for the offense side, but more recently in bug bounties for the defense side. And what does that mean in terms of how we're shaping our markets? But over 20 years ago, these friends of mine, who I grew up with in Boston learning how to hack together, testified before the Senate first. They were called to the Senate to explain how fragile the internet was. And recently, we did a reunion, a 20-year reunion in the Senate, where I was able to moderate the Loft panel once again. And we talked about what are the things that have changed, how have they improved, what is the same, and what is different. The fact of the matter is, we have a much larger internet than we did 20 years ago, that we had trouble securing, when systems were less complex and when you didn't carry computers around inside your pockets. But what have we learned from all these lessons? Well, this was the reunion, and one thing we've learned is that even though you can't regain your youth, you might be able to regain some of your youthful hair. Mudge actually brought that wig himself. But how did we get here? I mean, the industry itself that we've built over the last 20 years, which many of us have been a part of, it didn't just grow up overnight. We were able to create systems and services that were designed to help secure this growing internet. The opportunity in this market to make money has always been there. And yet, we're still seeing silver bullets being presented in the same way that they were 20 years ago. How many of you remember when it was difficult to sell a firewall, when the entire internet was open? And how many of you remember, there are a few who do, how many of you remember when it was difficult to explain to people why you would want to hire professional hackers to test your security as penetration testers? You must remember this, because it's really only just very recently that the expert help of outside security experts has been truly embraced. However, we're still here where we have critical deployment problems. It's the last mile, or I guess the last kilometer, really. It's the last kilometer of securing systems, is that even when you are able to identify vulnerabilities and build fixes, deploying them is still complex. And we still have trouble implementing these solutions. Even with all of the money we've put into these solutions and all of the money that we in the security industry have been able to make from these solutions, we're still having basic hygiene problems covering that last kilometer of getting those patches deployed. So here are some of the experiences that I want to highlight. So we talked about, or in my intro, it was mentioned that I started Microsoft's bug bounty program. That was one inflection point between the solution that had been going for the last 20 years of penetration testing and this new one, which is a variation of penetration testing known as bug bounties. And bug bounties is simply rewarding individuals as opposed to hiring professional contractors to find these bugs. It's being positioned as a much more cost-effective way to find out about security holes. And in fact, some of the rhetoric from the open source community, many eyes make all bugs shallow, have been used to sell bug bounties. Now, I love bug bounties. Well-architected bug bounties can be a powerful tool in the arsenal of security. But the second inflection point here is interesting to me, because the second inflection point was this year, was the first year that search terms on Google for bug bounty exceeded searches for penetration testing. So we're at this point where it's still a similar idea of hiring external experts, but it's at a much different risk profile than traditional penetration testing. So what is the difference? Well, the act of vulnerability disclosure, some of you may know, I work on the ISO standards of vulnerability disclosure and vulnerability handling processes. And vulnerability disclosure itself is simply the process of receiving a bug report and then doing some kind of remediation and then releasing that remediation. It doesn't require any cash incentives to work. It's a process. It's a cycle. This could happen at any time and not just from hackers. So then penetration testing, again, it's that professional service, and it carries certainly some risk, And certainly some things, as we early professional penetration testers heard in the early 2000s of people saying to us, we can't possibly trust you, even though you're a professional service. How do we know you're not going to hoard some of these bugs that you find when we give you permission to test us? How do we know that you're not going to keep them and exploit them later or sell them? We had to overcome some of those fears, and now we've got bug bounty programs. The Wild West, or in this case, the Wild India, because many of the bug bounty hunters in the world are actually coming from India with the current bug bounty market. We'll talk a little bit about that later. But along the continuum, there are different risk profiles for these activities. Almost everybody must have some way to process vulnerability reports, even if you don't write your own code. Why? Because you are deploying somebody else's code. You are part of a software and hardware supply chain, even as consumers. Penetration testing itself still has its limitations, and we saw in the industry as it changed over the last 20 years, where certain companies, like At Stake, where I was from, we were very honest in our marketing. No wonder we never survived, right? We were too honest. We said, you will never be 100% secure. Whereas other penetration testers would say, we will find all the bugs. Similarly, we are seeing some of these same marketing tropes repeated with bug bounty. So what if we just do vulnerability disclosure? What if we just start there? What if we just start a bug bounty and see what happens? Well, a lot of people think it will be a rush, but a friendly rush. Happy little white hat hackers, maybe a few gray hats in there, but just happy little hackers. But actually, what it turns out to look like is much more like this. You know, it's an unknown group, and your adversaries and your allies are mixed in doing the same activities, and you actually can't tell the difference. There are troubles in distinguishing friends from foes in this model. There's also the fact that in the Uber data breach case, we confused these young hackers by telling them and sending them a message in that instance that if you follow the bug bounty rules, you maybe will make $10,000. If you download 57 million records, you will make 10 times that amount. And unfortunately, what happened, does anybody know what happened with that Uber data breach case? Well, about a month ago, the Federal Trade Commission fined them for that cover-up, where they used their bug bounty program to cover up the data breach, fined them $148 million. And then a few weeks ago, the hackers who had been given the wrong idea about how they could conduct themselves in this new market, they tried the same thing on another organization, and they were arrested, and they've been indicted. So as we're building this market, we are shaping how we engage with this community, how we pull these bugs in, and what we do about it. We're shaping it based on our risk profiles, but also on how much money we feel like spending. And a lot of people have said that AI and machine learning is going to be our future. How many of you heard of the DARPA Cyber Grand Challenge? Well, when that was in its infancy, when it was just an idea from DARPA, they had asked me, what do you think if we had a full AI capture the flag, and what if we could have AI discover thousands, tens of thousands of vulnerabilities? I simply explained that they would outdo the capacity of any response organization to be able to respond to that. So they changed it to be an AI attack and AI defense competition. They also changed it such that it wasn't going to be aimed at real targets. They wrote some software that doesn't exist in the world to be able to train these AI combatants. Well, the bad news for organizations is that we are going to be ending up in an adversarial situation that we can't keep up with. And yet, we try to tell ourselves that we can control the variables. So this happened, I believe, in September, and I apologize for this person's profanity in these tweets, but this was a member of military personnel who stole an unarmored vehicle from a military base and drove it for over 2 hours in, Virginia. So here's what happened. Let's see. Now, he was apprehended and nobody was hurt. But when they took him out and they tased him, he claimed that he was authorized to perform this test, that he was testing the security of the base, and that this was actually on a freeway in the United States for about 2.5 hours. The chase started in daylight and ended in downtown Virginia, Richmond. Thank you. I kept thinking it was Raleigh, and it's not Raleigh. So this was the end. And luckily, again, nobody was hurt, but he claimed that he was authorized. So this brings us to this other big marketing myth. And that's where the bug bounty platforms are all saying that they can make this easy for you. Where have we heard this before? We've heard this in marketing in our industry for the past 20 years, that there's an easy button, there's a service that can take care of this for you. It's a managed service. You don't have to worry. But remember, the internal capacity to deal with bugs still has to be built. And that capacity and that rhythm changes when you offer cash rewards. It shifts the dynamic. Now, one thing that is surprising about this market is that, yes, actually bug bounty companies can take care of some of these things for you, but it's relying on some false premises, such that the labor market in staffing, the triage for this, is infinite and trustworthy. So, back in 2007, I had just started working for Microsoft. Popular Science that year had named Microsoft Security Grunt among the top 10 worst jobs in science. It was somewhere in between whale feces researcher and elephant vasectomist. It was somewhere in between there of how bad that job was. And this was a job where the folks who were on the front lines were getting paid 6 figures, full Microsoft benefits, stock, and everything. And at Microsoft, you had a rule. You had to be working in the same job for 12 months before you could apply for a different job in the company, and you'd have to ask your manager's permission. 18 months in the same job, and then you could go ahead and interview inside the company and not have to ask your manager's permission. This job was the hardest job to stay staffed. They would be trying to leave at 12 months. If you know anything about Microsoft's average time to fix, 12 months, you'd be lucky if you had barely trained these folks in how to release a bulletin fully from end to end, from case coming in, all through the investigation and the fix. So this idea that we have an infinite supply of skilled, trustworthy triage labor, that's one of the myths. That's one of the myths in the new security of the last 5 years. And Microsoft is unique, obviously. They are unique because of scale. It is not a joke that they receive between 150,000 and 200,000 non-spam email messages every year to secure at Microsoft. So that is the largest intake funnel in the world for security vulnerabilities. So obviously, they've learned some efficiencies, but they've also learned where the process breaks down, where the weak points are, and it's always about labor. So, even if this mythological, service can clean the bug feed for you, and the only bugs you're getting are valid, actual security bugs, there is such a thing as too much of a good thing. A lot of folks in our industry are actually, who have never worked defending a large, complex enterprise, don't understand, well, if you have a bug fixing mechanism internally, why wouldn't you just turn it on and open it to the outside? And I've explained it sort of like, look, you might be able to train for a marathon. My brother is the athlete of the family, and he does marathons. I'm the mathlete of the family. But you can train for a marathon. However, nothing would prepare you from running from a predator, right? And running from a predator for 26 miles versus a marathon where you get to choose your own pace is the difference between these dynamics. So there is a maturity model. I created a maturity model for vulnerability coordination. And actually, we've seen, even in the communication capability area, we've seen this come out in the last couple of days with communications about vulnerability response. There was the city of York had a vulnerable API that was exposing, residential data, personally identifiable information, and some security researcher had reached out, told them that they could access all of this private information. They published the fact that they actually were breached, even though they had a vulnerability disclosure program. They said that they contacted the police. Now, the researchers on Twitter started piling on and saying, that this was terrible. And I took a look at it and I said, wait a minute, there was a breach. They provided more information after that Twitter exchange, and actually, it turned out they had tried to reach the researcher once more to clarify, couldn't reach them, they wouldn't respond, and so that's when they involved the police, because at that point, all they had was, data has been breached, somebody just told us, and now that person is not responding. So the communication effort and the ability to do this process well and gracefully, that last leg of communication seemed to have fallen down in this instance. So it's not just your engineering capabilities that you need to build up in order to have the muscle memory to deal with vulnerabilities. So what is the bug bounty ecosystem starting to look like? Remember I said that a lot of the bug bounty hunters are actually coming from India right now. Well, the reason for that is that the marketing has been so effective at bug bounties that we've got organizations starting bug bounties who have not done their own due diligence. They have not looked for the low-hanging fruit themselves. Therefore, easy bug bounties are coming out for organizations that may not be ready to deal with it. So they're paying for a lot of very unsophisticated bugs. Cross-site scripting vulnerabilities are things that can generally be found using free or low-cost tools. You could have an intern who is learning security find a bunch of these bugs for you. You don't need a bug bounty to do it. So what we're seeing is we're seeing bug bounty companies successfully marketing this as a new solution and a more cost-effective one. And we're seeing organizations say, look at how much we care about security. Look at how much we paid in bug bounties. But where the analysis seems to stop is the depth at which we understand the vulnerabilities themselves. And not all bugs are created equal. So this is part of the research that I have references at the end of this presentation for you to look at some of this research in more detail. But this was published in October of last year as a chapter of an MIT Press book. And it was part of a paper on the labor market. And one of the things that we looked at is that not all vulnerabilities are created equal. And an organization to actually get better needs to go from a lot of low-hanging fruit that is easily discoverable to a situation where there are fewer vulnerabilities, harder to find, more sophisticated. This is what we've seen in terms of the evolution of the major operating systems and brands. You've seen it evolve in terms of, Internet Explorer used to be the worst, right? And then over the years, those vulnerabilities became harder to find. So what we look at is a taxonomy and a typology of vulnerabilities when we're trying to assess whether or not an organization has, one, built the muscle memory to deal with vulnerabilities, and two, has built the organizational capability to incorporate that into their either secure development lifecycle and not make the same mistakes again, or their deployment lifecycle if they're deploying other people's software, where they're actually making better procurement choices, where they're making better contracting choices, to have those bugs that are created by third parties that they're running on their systems actually serviced in a reasonable amount of time. So if you want to start a vulnerability disclosure program or a bug bounty program, the most common thing that I have seen is the misunderstanding of the target. You put it out there that you want a certain type of bug, and without the clarity of scope, you end up with a whole bunch of bugs that you don't actually care about. They might be real bugs, but they're taking up your resources in this solicitation where you've asked people to come and bring you some bugs. We see this over and over again. Tor has a bug bounty program. Hardly any critical issues coming in through that program. Now, you may say, well, they're just not paying enough. But I would say that honestly, the open source community has a labor shortage problem also. How many of you heard about the NPM module in Node.js that the maintainer had apparently handed over to somebody else because the maintainer was alone, unsupported, and this is used, I think, downloaded over 2 million times and incorporated into a ton of applications. That is fresh from yesterday. So when we think about what kinds of resources you have, what are you actually using them for? What investments have you made? If you're investing in a bug bounty before you've cleared out your own low-hanging fruit, well, guess what? That is all you will get. You will get a lot of low-hanging fruit, and the internal resources you have will start thinking that a job as an elephant vasectomist sounds a lot better, right? So the myths about motivations of hackers and the markets. Behavioral economics is something that we should be looking into when we are creating this economy, right? This market is being built deliberately as we speak. But remember, I said the process of vulnerability disclosure is independent of paying a cash reward or not. A lot of folks believe that a bug bounty is the strategic end goal of all vulnerability disclosure programs. And frankly, it's inappropriate. It's not necessarily the best source, especially for very sophisticated, very, very complex vulnerability hunting and secure design. There's a myth that hackers will only look for bugs in exchange for cash rewards. Remember I said that Microsoft received 150,000 to 200,000 non-spam email messages a year? That was true before the bug bounties, and that is true today. The volume has not changed. So all of those hackers before the bug bounties were willing to give Microsoft critical vulnerabilities, each worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not more, on other markets, and they were willing to give them to Microsoft for free. Not only that, at one point, when we started the Microsoft bug bounties, there's a set of questions that, a US-based company has to ask before they pay anyone. They have to make sure that the individual is not on a sanctioned list or living in a country that is sanctioned by the United States. So there's a series of questions. And at the time of the Microsoft bug bounties, $100,000 was the highest bug bounty being offered by any vendor on a continual basis. And that $100,000 was not for an individual bug or an exploit. It was for a brand new exploitation technique. And that's what we were looking for. So we were looking for the next ROP or the next JIT spray, that type of thing. Well, we got an email from someone and we asked them the questions. Where do you live? What's your name? Before we could even look at the submission. And he told us that he lived in Syria. And Microsoft, being a US-based company, cannot pay somebody who lives in Syria. So I took that one myself and I replied back respectfully, I'm so sorry. We're bound by, the rules of our country where we do business, and we won't be able to pay you. He said, thanks for letting me know. Here it is. And he gave it to us. He gave it to us. When, who knows how much money he could have gotten for that new technique and a brand new exploit with a 0-day. He didn't even need to give us the 0-day. We would have settled for him using his new technique on an already patched bug. So when I say that there is a myth that hackers will only work for the highest bidder, they will only do certain things for money, I bring up him and I bring up the 200,000 messages per year that were coming into Microsoft for free before the bounties. And then the final myth is that you somehow can only win in defense if you manage to outbid offense. That is one lever in the system dynamics that are going on here. But the fact that we have not been looking at this as a systems level problem and a labor market problem has really been the issue. So what is the truth? So bounties are not going to replace traditional penetration testing. There are skilled workers that you may need to have that are not going to be open to a bounty idea. I'm seeing a whole lot of bounties for car hacking, IoT hacking, specialty hacking. And the highest bounties are $10,000 or $15,000. Now, remember I said we're not here to outbid the black market, but we're also not here as professionals to gamble with our skills, to take something that's highly focused, like car hacking, a specialty skill, and then gamble on the chance to maybe get $10,000 or $15,000. There's no reason for that skill set in the labor market to do that. They can get a lucrative penetration testing contract under NDA and get paid no matter what. And the client will be happier because they will get those skilled workers under those circumstances. But bug bounties are not going to replace penetration tests. And then hackers, like all humans, because we still haven't been replaced by AI, are motivated by much more than money. You know, when I was a professional penetration tester, my favorite thing to do was rob banks. I loved robbing banks. The fact of the matter is, in the early 2000s, in the beginning of online banking, you didn't actually have to cover your tracks very much. There were ways that you could dupe banking systems, early banking systems, into creating money that didn't exist. So you weren't even robbing anybody. You weren't robbing a bank. You weren't robbing another human being. You were just manipulating the bits to say that you had more. Now, obviously, that was a point in my young life when I had to make a choice. And, you know, it's kind of like Lord of the Rings when Frodo tries to hand Galadriel the ring and she hands it back and says, nope, not going to take this ring. All hackers have some kind of a moral compass, and that moral compass can evolve as we get older, as our priorities shift in our lives. One of the things that we found when we studied the labor market for vulnerabilities was that there's an average highly active period of security researchers about 7 years. That makes perfect sense. That's in the rhythm of the generations of our technology. Our technology has been revolutionized on these cycles of 7 to 10 years. I mean, the iPhone, it's just over 10 years old. The modern era of smartphones. So if you think about it, a researcher is going to stay highly active on average for about that time before their priorities and their goals change and the things that they want to do in the world and the things they want to spend time on may change. And then the fact of the matter is, on the outbidding, the defense market can only go so high. And why is that? When we talk about labor, there are many roles in this ecosystem that need to be filled, not just the attacker roles. So this is just a still of the system dynamics model that we created when we were looking at the vulnerability economy and exploit market. What you really need to know about this is that we looked at how do we increase the chances that defenders will find and extinguish as many of the same bugs as the offense side is finding to exploit. How can we increase that overlap? And putting more money into this system wasn't going to work. It wasn't going to shift the balance in favor of defenders as well as some of the other levers. So one thing we had to watch out for is perverse incentives. Again, this is an old comic. This was written even longer than 20 years ago, back in 1995, when Netscape had a bug bounty. And if we think about the long tradition of outsourcing software development, especially to India, and now we have this emerging bug bounty economy focused in India, you can begin to see the opportunities for market collusion as we speak, unfolding in front of us. And that's not just in places where we are outsourcing. That can happen internally as well. Some of the folks who now, in the last year, have started offering $250,000 bounties, Microsoft, Intel, others, when they are trying to solicit help from the outside, what they're actually doing is telling every single person who currently works for them that the things that we hired you to do every day are now worth $250,000 a pop to somebody who doesn't work here. How will you maintain your labor workforce after a certain point paying these high prices in the defense market? And the argument being that, well, it's a high skill, and so it should have a high price. Well, I agree with that, except in the way that it's being processed and delivered. As a bug bounty, it's a different dynamic, and it shifts the labor market accordingly. So, how did we do this at Microsoft? Why do I still believe in bug bounties? Even though I've just been talking about how damaging they are currently. Well, at Microsoft, we were already getting so many bugs. The leaders in my group were skeptical that we could come up with a model that wouldn't just increase busy work and instead actually shift from some of the bugs that we knew were there, but we had already advanced past that in our latest versions, and actually shift to looking for bugs in the absolute latest versions when we had done the best we could for security. So what you're looking at here is a data pattern. The white, if you can see it, the low line was actual data of vulnerabilities reported to Microsoft during the beta period of IE 10. Very few. And then you see a big white spike. And what that represents is the spike of vulnerability reports that happened as soon as the beta was over. Now, why, if our friendly hackers were willing to give us these bug reports, valuable bug reports for free, why were they waiting until after it was the worst time for us to hear about it, right? Beta was over. And the reason was we had only given them one incentive, and that was recognition. They had learned from our conditioning before the bug bounties that if they just waited until after the beta was over, they had a high chance of getting a real bulletin and their name published. If they had given it to us during beta and it only affected the very latest software, so to Microsoft, the most valuable bug, if they gave that bug to us during beta and it didn't affect earlier versions, they would get nothing. They would get a thanks in an email and no credit, because no bulletins go out for beta software when it only affects beta. So the prediction I made is the dotted pink line. And this was the slide that I showed the leaders of IE that convinced them to not only start a bug bounty, but to pay for the bugs themselves. Because I told them, I can shift when you receive these vulnerability reports. I can put these friendly eyes, who are already friendly, over to a time in the first 30 days of the IE 11 beta period, get those bugs in sooner, and that is an activation of this labor force that's already working with you, but focusing them on what version and when. So, what is this check for $100,000? That's approximately how big it was in real life. It was a huge check. This was not my idea. This was the hacker's idea. James Forshaw. He was the first recipient of the $100,000 mitigation bypass bounty from Microsoft. And he had participated in the IE bounty because I asked him to. He had never looked at IE before. But the bugs that I saw that he was reporting in the .NET framework were one of those things that I think I said, he can not just see the lady in the red dress, but he can see the code that rendered the lady in the red dress in the matrix. He is one of those types who can see past your architecture and find all kinds of interesting bugs. So he not only contributed to the 18 bulletin class vulnerabilities that came in during the IE 11 beta bug bounty, he contributed 4 sandbox escapes during that period, 4 distinct ones. But he also came in, again, never having looked at mitigation bypasses, and was able to channel his skill into that. And how did I convince him to do this? Well, it took some beer in London. It did. But it also took some of him asking his employer at the time, a penetration testing company, if he could have 3 weeks off to work on this. So they made a bet, sacrificing his billable time for this payout and this publicity. But that labor of someone who can see those bugs and write them up and find them in a consistent way, that type of person, well, you can imagine. James is at Project Zero these days, right? It's a very small number of individuals worldwide. When we did the system dynamics model and when we looked at the labor market, there's, remember, that study of about 7 years of activity of the top tier researchers. Well, guess how many there are? If some are coming into the labor market and some are dropping out, there's basically a steady number of a few thousand individuals worldwide who are capable of doing these things. Some of them are in this room right now. But it's not an infinite labor market. So, hack the Pentagon. When I launched Microsoft Bug Bounties, I gave a talk at an invited talk at MIT and Harvard. It was a lecture symposium for Sloan School and Kennedy School. And I talked about some of those economic levers that we used to create the Microsoft Bug Bounty programs, using our own data, knowing who was looking at our bugs, when they were reporting it, and shaping the traffic. After I gave that talk, I was invited to the Pentagon for the first time to give a briefing there. And roughly 3 years later, we launched Hack the Pentagon. This was an experiment. This was the first time that it was legal for anybody in the United States to test security vulnerabilities without an explicit contract in place in DoD websites. And it was also the first time that the DoD was going to pay hackers in that way. So I want to call your attention to the numbers here. So over 1,400 people registered. We were hoping for a few hundred, but it turned out over 1,000. And then look at the reports received versus the valid reports. The signal to noise in that ratio was not good. It was also not good to start a bug bounty at midnight. Do not do that, because at 13 minutes was the first report. The next thing we did in this continuum was launch Hack the Army. That's the former Secretary of the Army in the middle there, Secretary Fanning. And we had given out challenge coins as part of Hack the Pentagon. And so the Hack the Army challenge coin, the challenge coins for Hack the Pentagon had some binary around the edges that said, "I hacked the Pentagon." Right after this photo was taken, this Secretary of the Army had asked us, so for the binary around our challenge coin, can we have it say, "Hack the Army, beat Navy"? Football, right? It's American football. So we did. That's actually what it says on those coins. And that first time in 50 years, the Army did beat Navy in a football game. I'm thinking it was related. But look at the numbers on this. So one, we've got far fewer registered participants. That was deliberate. That was a lever that we could do. We could cap the number of participants. And now you look at the signal to noise, much better. Over 400 to 100 valid issues. Same time period. Same preparation of the targets ahead of time, of looking for that low-hanging fruit yourself and then launching the bug bounty. But it was a much better result. It was a much more sustainable result. Remember all of the people who are inside your organizations who have to flex those muscles to fix these vulnerabilities as they come in. This configuration was protecting your entire labor market, as opposed to just saying, how many bugs can we find? And how many hackers can we pay outside? So the labor market for bug hunting versus bug fixing versus code writing. When we think about the world that we live in, somebody had to write those bugs. Someone wrote that code. When I testified before the Senate on the Uber data breach, one of the things I asked for the Senate to do, because you always have to ask Congress to do something, you have the opportunity, is that the top 10 U.S. universities that teach computer science have no security requirement. And I don't know what it's like in universities here, but for us, that's detrimental. We are cranking out not code writers, but bug writers, right? And they're making the same mistakes. So how can we hope to attack this problem of security at scale when the very people that we are training for the next generation, in formal education at least, have no formal education or background required of them in security? In India, the last report from one of the bug bounty companies say that you can make 16 times more as a bug bounty hunter than you can as a software developer. They were proud of that statistic, instead of seeing it for what it was, gutting parts of the labor market. So here we are. There are bills that have been proposed and passed in the United States or still in consideration for replicating the success of Hack the Pentagon. Hack the DHS, hack the State Department. But those of us who actually had to build those muscles to process this, to make this something that was sustainable, we're exercising caution. We're advising caution. And we're saying that, look, these other agencies lack those fixers, those maintainers. They lack the appropriate internal people to prioritize those bugs. Triage of, is this a bug or isn't it, and how severe, is different from prioritization of, I have a pile of bugs, they're all very important, and how do I, the business owner, decide what's the most important to me? That is not something that your bug bounty company is going to be able to tell you and teach you. So, a lot of people are saying, well, let's just force it. Let's just pass the law and make the requirements. But in the end, what are we doing? We are still selling a silver bullet for a complex problem that only scratches the surface of the possible solution space. So a lot of people at this point say, wait a minute, you started these bug bounties and now you're saying they're bad. Well, I'm saying they're good for some things. They're great for recruiting, but so is a capture the flag competition. They're great for finding bugs you missed if you actually did your due diligence. But again, it's something that you have to focus in order to get the benefit from. It is not an appropriate thing to do as your first external foray into dealing with vulnerabilities. My company helps governments, complex organizations figure out what are these internal capabilities that you need. And some of these complex organizations have come to my company and said, we want to start a bug bounty. We hear that you're a great architect of those things. And I say, okay, tell me, how many reports are you receiving today? And they say, oh, we've never received a single report ever in our lives. And I start to tell them that it isn't all that simple. That just knowing about the bugs, not only does that not cover your labor, it doesn't even cover your customers or your users' labor in understanding what it is that you're now suddenly telling them. Organizations going from, we don't talk about security, we have no reporting process, to suddenly a bug bounty, you're going to be missing a lot of these capabilities. So, what should you actually do instead? Much like people cannot take a magical diet pill to lose weight in most cases, you must actually change your internal focus. Look at where your gaps really are. Pay attention to the typology of the vulnerabilities that you are seeing and deploying. Because if you're not paying attention to the number and the severity and the complexity of the bugs, you will end up living in this zone of very simple, preventable bugs over and over again forever. And that's a place you could be if you're content with that. But you will be having to cycle and replace your labor internally. And if you think a bug bounty will solve the problem, and you think that maybe paying higher prices will entice folks, then you have to be prepared for your internal people to question, why are you paying an external person who found one thing for you half my salary for the whole year? Build sustainability, build your priorities, identify your gaps. And in all things, You have to balance. There are so many cultures that have this idea of balance in all things. When I was young, boy, I really loved destruction. I was in several punk bands, and I loved hacking. And as I've gotten older, and my human priorities have shifted, I look towards creation and maintenance. These are all parts of the labor market that need to be understood, honored, and created opportunities for. Last night, at the restaurant, the speaker dinner had cleared out, and they had live music and a belly dancer, which was amazing and beautiful. But we are evolving in this industry. What I don't want to see is for me to come back here on my 64th birthday, 20 years, telling you that we still haven't solved these basic problems, that we still haven't figured out basic security hygiene, that we still haven't figured out how to deploy the patches when we actually write them and make them available, and how do we build sustainable communities of attackers, defenders, blended teams, where this rhythm, where people are going to evolve not only in their interests and careers, but our industry needs to evolve. Getting out of the low-hanging fruit. I should not be able to still hack things anymore. I retired over a decade ago. The fact that I can still hack things, that's a problem. When I'm 64, I better not be able to hack any of you. So these are the resources that I was talking about that you can, and I've made the slides available. But the very last thought that I want to leave you with before we go to a break is the fact that we have an untapped resource in the world of people who are trying to learn. I met some university students here, and I told them that when I was in school, we didn't have any of these programs. The woman here is the mother of this young girl who is learning how to solder and pick locks. A few years ago, this woman, pregnant with this child, was homeless in a shelter. So when we consider the labor market and all the different roles that need to be filled, we should be considering all of our resources. Those two photos on the end, the one on top is me turned away from the camera with my natural hair color. And the one on the bottom was me doing a penetration test in the at-stake office on some video games, online video games. And I had bought a matching pink television to go with my hoodie that the video game company had given me after the successful last penetration test. I think we need to look at our labor market in a different way. I think we need to be creative about how we approach these problems and not continue to repeat and accept numbers at face value that are only marketing deep. So with that, I will release you to your break. Thank you so much for having me, and I hope that in 20 years, you will have surprised me. Thank you.